In the heart of Georgia's eastern landscape, in the quaint town of Gori, a man who would leave an indelible mark on history was born. Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, later known as Joseph Stalin, entered the world on December 18, 1878.
Through the 30 years of his rule, he remained unchallenged even by members of the Supreme Council.
His father, Vissarion Djugashvili, crafted shoes for a living. Once thriving, Vissarion's refusal to adapt to changing fashion trends eventually plunged his family into poverty. Joseph's mother, Ekaterina Galadze, was a deeply religious Orthodox Christian. She married Vissarion at 16 and bore him 3 sons. Tragically, the 2 eldest succumbed in infancy, leaving Joseph as their only surviving child. Ekaterina's dreams for her son's future clashed violently with Vissarion's. While she envisioned Joseph joining the priesthood, Vissarion insisted on him following in his footsteps as a cobbler. Their home was anything but peaceful. Vissarion's descent into alcoholism led to frequent and violent disputes, especially over Joseph's future. The situation worsened when Vissarion turned abusive, once beating Joseph so severely that he suffered health consequences for days. Seeking refuge, Ekaterina turned to a family friend, Yakov Egnatashvili, who had ties to their past and shared in their grief, having been the godfather to their deceased sons. Under Yakov's protection, Ekaterina managed to find some stability, taking up housework for friends and local clergy. One such friend, priest Christopher Charkviani, played a pivotal role in securing Joseph's education, enrolling him in Gori's church school in 1888. Joseph thrived academically, quickly rising to the top of his class. However, life continued to challenge him. He barely survived a smallpox outbreak, which left his face scarred, and he suffered a severe injury to his left arm in an accident, permanently impairing it. Despite these setbacks, Joseph's academic brilliance shone through. His rebellious streak, however, became more pronounced. He often clashed with authority, showing open disdain for religious teachings, and developed a keen interest in radical literature, including works by Nikolai Chernyshevsky and Karl Marx. Joseph's growing resentment towards the oppressive Russian Tsarist regime led him to secret socialist worker meetings. His involvement in these groups marked the beginning of his departure from the spiritual seminary and his foray into active resistance. The late 19th century was a tumultuous time for Russia. The Romanov dynasty's 300-year reign was characterized by a rigid, agriculture-based economy and a largely impoverished populace. The absolute power of the Tsars, bolstered by the conservative Orthodox Church, was beginning to wane, with discontent simmering across the nation. The advent of technology, like the printing press and the eventual loosening of press restrictions in 1912, brought a wave of political awareness and expression. Russia's centralized power structure, both its strength and weakness, hinged on the Tsar's capabilities. Under Alexander III, who succeeded his assassinated father, Alexander II, any hopes for a liberal Russia were dashed. Alexander III's hardline policies stamped out dissent, delaying the inevitable unrest. In 1894, with Alexander III's death, the stage was set for dramatic shifts in Russia's political landscape, shifts that would eventually propel Joseph Stalin into the annals of history as one of its most controversial figures. In 1894, Russia's landscape changed with the death of Tsar Alexander III at just 49 due to kidney disease. His replacement, Nicholas II, needed to gain his father's capability and ruthlessness. Nicholas continued Alexander's authoritarian policies, but his lack of resolve and competence only fanned the flames of revolution. Georgia, a part of the Russian Empire since 1801, felt the oppressive weight of these policies. Following the assassination of Alexander II, Georgia was reduced to a mere colony, its language and culture suppressed, further igniting local resentment and radical sentiments. During this time, Joseph Stalin, then working as a meteorologist in Tbilisi, delved deeper into revolutionary literature, nurturing a fierce opposition to the Tsarist regime and the Orthodox Church. His involvement in organizing strikes and attending underground socialist meetings soon attracted the attention of the Tsar's secret police, forcing him into hiding. Stalin joined the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSDLP, in 1899. This movement, later evolving into the Communist Party, employed tactics of infiltration and agitation within factories, stirring worker opposition against employers and authorities, often resulting in violent clashes with the police. Stalin quickly rose through the ranks due to his talent for such agitation. His radicalism and advocacy for violence soon landed him a spot on the local party committee in 1901. However, to avoid arrest, Stalin moved to Batumi, where his organized protests led to his arrest and a 3-year exile to Siberia in 1903. Unlike later exiles under his regime, this was a temporary punishment, but Stalin had no intention of respecting its terms. He returned to Tbilisi, advocating for the Georgian branch of the RSDLP to split from the Russian one. The 1905 revolution marked a crucial point in Russian history. The Mensheviks and Bolsheviks emerged as factions within the RSDLP. Naturally gravitating towards the hardline Bolsheviks, Stalin played a significant role in the 1905 unrest in Georgia, the infamous Bloody Sunday in St. Petersburg, where Tsar's troops fired upon unarmed civilians, only intensified the revolutionary fervor. Stalin formed the Bolshevik battle squad, engaging in robberies, raids, and armed conflicts with government forces. His increasing prominence led him to meet Vladimir Lenin and travel to the 4th Congress of the RSDLP in Stockholm. Despite a vote against violent fundraising methods, Stalin and Lenin continued their armed campaigns, culminating in a high-profile robbery in Tbilisi. Stalin's criminal activities, including kidnapping, eventually led to his arrest and another exile in 1912. However, Lenin soon called him to join the Bolshevik Central Committee. Stalin escaped yet again, going underground in St. Petersburg to edit the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda. He adopted the pseudonym Stalin, meaning steel, marking his ascendance as a critical figure in the Bolshevik movement and Lenin's close associate. By the outbreak of World War I, Stalin's influence was undeniable despite multiple arrests and exiles. Though initially conscripted into the Russian army, his disabled arm exempted him from service. Stalin's journey was marked by resilience, radicalism, and a ruthless pursuit of power, setting the stage for his eventual rise to the pinnacle of Soviet politics. Revolution of 1917 and Russian Civil War. As World War I raged on, Stalin's life took yet another turn. During his exile in Siberia, the February Revolution of 1917 erupted, toppling Nicholas II and setting up a provisional government under Alexander Kerensky. But this new government's hold on Russia was tenuous, allowing the Bolsheviks to grow their influence. In a bold move on November 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks seized control of vital infrastructure in St. Petersburg. The Soviet warship Aurora fired upon the Winter Palace, leading to the surrender of the provisional government. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were now the rulers of Russia, and they immediately set about consolidating their power. The Cheka, Bolsheviks' secret police, was instrumental in suppressing any opposition, leading to an estimated 100,000 deaths. The Russian capital was moved from St. Petersburg to Moscow, partly for strategic reasons and partially to break from Tsarist associations. However, Russia's war woes continued. The dilapidated economy could barely sustain the army, leading to widespread chaos and food shortages. Lenin sought peace, and a ceasefire with Germany was reached in December 1917, formalized by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Even as World War I ended for Russia, internal strife escalated. The Bolsheviks' rise to power had unified a diverse opposition known as the White Russians, sparking the Russian Civil War. Under Leon Trotsky's leadership, the Red Army subdued its enemies, reasserting Bolshevik control. During the Civil War, Stalin, now back from exile, was appointed to Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad, to secure food supplies and oversee military operations against the White forces. His tenure was marked by criticism for his brutal tactics and massive troop losses. Stalin's ruthlessness became a hallmark of his leadership, exemplified by the execution of Nicholas II and his family in July 1918. Stalin's role in the Polish-Soviet War further displayed his harsh methods, leading to criticism within the Bolshevik Party. The war ended in Poland's favor, enabling the Bolsheviks to focus on internal consolidation. The early 1920s saw renewed opposition, particularly from the rural population, largely unaffected by the communist takeover. The Civil War had devastated the countryside, leading to food shortages and a mass migration southward. The Bolsheviks intensified their food requisitioning policies to feed the army and urban centers, resulting in famine and the death of millions. Lenin's 1921 new economic policy marked a shift, blending state industry with private enterprise and replacing food requisitioning with taxation. This policy allowed farmers to keep and sell crops, alleviating some of the country's dire conditions. Stalin's rise. Stalin's rise to power in the wake of the 1917 revolution was marked by strategic acumen and ruthless maneuvering. While Lenin and Trotsky favored different economic approaches, Stalin, aligning with Lenin, supported a mix of state control and private enterprise. His support for Lenin's policies and his administrative skills led to his nomination as the party's general secretary in 1922. This role granted him immense influence within the Soviet government. As Lenin's health declined following a severe stroke in 1922, Stalin became his intermediary, gaining access to crucial information and controlling Lenin's communications. However, Lenin's diminishing opinion of Stalin was evident in his testament, where he criticized Stalin's intelligence and recommended his removal from the position of General Secretary. This document, potentially career-ending for Stalin, was suppressed by him and his colleagues. In December 1922, the formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, marked a significant milestone. However, Lenin's death in January 1924 ignited a power struggle within the Communist Party, with Stalin and Trotsky emerging as key contenders. Stalin's strategic placement of loyalists within the party, garnered through his role as General Secretary, gradually weakened Trotsky's position. Stalin's bureaucratic control and political cunning were instrumental in his rise. He effectively isolated Trotsky, who increasingly criticized Stalin's policies and aligned with the left opposition. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the Central Committee and, in 1929, from the Soviet Union. Stalin's consolidation of power was complete when Trotsky was assassinated in 1940 by a Soviet agent in Mexico City. With Trotsky's exile, Stalin emerged as the undisputed leader. Being under his influence, most committee members rendered him the de facto boss of the Soviet regime. Vyacheslav Molotov, one of his most trusted supporters, played a key role in this consolidation of power and later in foreign affairs, including interactions with Hitler leading up to World War II. Stalin's economic policy during the 1920s focused on re-establishing agricultural collectivization. This move would have profound implications for the Soviet Union, both internally and on the international stage. Stalin's economic policy. In the late 1920s, Stalin faced a critical dilemma in shaping the Soviet Union's future. Concerns grew that Lenin's new economic policy was too capitalist, especially as peasant farmers, or kulaks, appeared to be profiting from it. A drastic drop in grain supplies further fueled these apprehensions. Stalin's response was radical. He revised Lenin's policy, emphasizing rapid industrialization and reintroducing collectivization in his first five-year plan, 1928-1932. This plan led to a boom in industrial output and workforce, but at a devastating human cost. The forced collectivization and liquidation of the kulaks, seen as a threat to the socialist state, resulted in widespread famine and death, possibly in the millions. Stalin's ruthless approach was straightforward. He would not tolerate any form of dissent or resistance. The Red Army and NKVD, the Soviet Union's secret police, brutally suppressed any opposition. By 1929, Stalin sought to exert complete state control over every aspect of Soviet life, from education to religion, aiming to eradicate any traces of individualism or capitalism. This drive towards a pure communist society left Stalin with a stark choice: preserve some freedoms and risk the collapse of socialism, or enforce strict state control and suppress all dissent. The latter path which Stalin chose revealed a fundamental flaw in socialism practiced in the Soviet Union: the reliance on force to achieve collectivization, as people were often unwilling to surrender their private property. Stalin's policies, particularly in agriculture, proved disastrous. The severe winter of 1932, combined with the inefficiencies of collectivized farming, led to a catastrophic famine, particularly in Ukraine and southern Russia, resulting in nearly 3 million deaths. Despite the tragedy, Stalin persisted in exporting grain to fund industrialization. blaming the famine on subversive elements rather than acknowledging the failure of his policies. The Great Terror and Great Purge that followed were Stalin's methods of eradicating any perceived threats to his regime. By the early 1930s, his dictatorship had become one of the most ruthless and all-encompassing in history. Stalin's vision for the Soviet Union, grounded in total state control and the suppression of any dissent, led to one of the darkest periods in modern history, marked by widespread suffering, famine, and fear. The Great Terror, the Great Purge initiated by Stalin in the mid-1930s, was one of the darkest chapters in Soviet history. The assassination of Stalin's close ally, Sergei Kirov, in December 1934, served as a catalyst for this ruthless campaign. While some suspect Stalin's involvement in Kirov's murder, he utilized the event as a pretext to eliminate potential threats, both real and imagined. From 1936 to 1938, Stalin orchestrated an extensive crackdown, targeting not just the Soviet population, but also the Red Army and the Communist Party itself. High-ranking officials, perceived dissidents, and even the wives of Stalin's close associates were arrested, exiled, or executed in show trials. The death toll from the Great Purge is estimated to be as high as 1.25 million, including former aristocrats, business owners, and clergy. The Gulag system, a network of forced labor camps, was another brutal instrument of Stalin's regime. Between 1930 and 1950, about 18 million people passed through these camps, with an estimated 1.5 million deaths. A significant aspect of the Great Purge was the decimation of the Red Army's officer corps. Hundreds of officers and generals were executed or exiled, severely weakening the army's leadership and combat readiness. This weakening was particularly impactful when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, contributing to the initial Soviet military losses. Meanwhile, in Europe, the rise of Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, known for his vehement anti-Bolshevism, prompted Stalin to prepare for potential conflict. However, the Red Army was in a diminished state due to the purges, with outdated or poorly maintained equipment. In a surprising move, Stalin pursued a policy of appeasement with Germany, culminating in the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact on August 23, 1939. Following Germany's invasion of Poland, the Soviet Union occupied eastern Poland as agreed in the pact. During this occupation, thousands of Polish officers and intellectuals were captured and executed by the Red Army and NKVD in the Katyn massacre of April and May 1940, resulting in the deaths of over 22,000 Poles. The occupation of Western Poland by the Soviets led Britain and France to declare war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Many anticipated a prolonged conflict similar to World War I, setting the stage for World War II's devastating and transformative events. World War II, Finland, and Barbarossa. As World War II unfolded, Stalin's actions revealed both strategic foresight and costly miscalculations. After providing Germany with food and oil supplies, Stalin turned his attention to Finland, intending to use it as a buffer zone against a potential conflict with Hitler and to secure naval ports in the Baltic Sea. However, the Winter War with Finland, beginning in November 1939, exposed the weaknesses of the Red Army. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority, the Soviets suffered heavy losses against the Finns' resilient defense. This conflict led to a much-needed overhaul of the Red Army, addressing its tactical and training deficiencies. Simultaneously, Stalin sought to secure buffer zones in the Baltic states and northern Romania, which were forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union in August 1940. This expansion was marked by mass arrests and deportations to suppress resistance in these regions. Initially, Stalin perceived Britain and France as more significant threats than Germany, stemming from their support of the White Army during the Russian Civil War. However, as Nazi ideology gained momentum, Stalin recognized the growing danger of Hitler's Third Reich, leading to a bolstering of Soviet military forces. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in August 1939, gave Stalin a false sense of security. He believed a prolonged war between Germany and the Western powers would allow the Soviet Union ample time to fortify its defenses. However, Germany's defeat of France in 1940 and the failure to invade Britain during the Battle of Britain shifted Hitler's focus to the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, commenced in June 1941 with a massive assault. Despite initial Soviet losses, the Red Army eventually mounted a historic comeback, playing a pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany. Contrary to some beliefs, Stalin had not neglected the Soviet Union's defenses. The Red Army was the largest in the world in 1941, with abundant men, tanks and aircraft. However, its size and the lack of experience in large-scale modern warfare initially could have improved its effectiveness. The German army, seasoned by recent victories, initially overwhelmed Soviet forces. Post-World War II analyses vary in attributing the reasons for the Soviet victory. Some theories highlight Hitler's strategic errors and miscalculations. In contrast, others suggest it was a closely fought battle that could have gone either way. Critics often argue that Stalin's leadership was flawed, but acknowledge that his eventual deference to military generals played a crucial role in the Soviet Union's triumph. Population and geography. World War II in the East was a complex and multifaceted conflict, with mistakes and strategic decisions playing pivotal roles on both sides. It is overly simplistic to attribute the outcome to a single factor or individual. The Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany was influenced by a variety of elements, including population size, geography, military strategy, and industrial capacity. The sheer size of the Soviet population was a significant advantage. With around 200 million people, nearly half under 20, the Soviet Union had a vast pool of potential soldiers. In contrast, Germany, including its annexed territories, had a smaller population and fewer fighting-age men. This demographic disparity became increasingly critical as the war progressed, with the Soviet Union able to replenish its ranks more effectively than Germany. Women also played a crucial role in the Soviet military effort, with approximately 800,000 serving in various capacities, including combat roles. Notable figures like sniper Tatiana Baramzina, who amassed a remarkable record of kills, exemplified the contribution of women to the Soviet war effort. Geography was another key factor. The vast expanses of the Soviet Union allowed for strategic withdrawals, stretching German supply lines and exacerbating the challenges of the harsh Russian winter. These conditions, combined with the Soviet Union's ability to rebuild and reform its military, proved disastrous for the German invaders. While the early stages of Operation Barbarossa saw remarkable German successes, the tide turned as the conflict dragged on. Contrary to German expectations of a quick victory, the prolonged nature of the war played into Soviet hands. Despite appearing as a miscalculation, Stalin's strategy of holding back significant portions of his troops ultimately helped avoid complete encirclement and destruction in the early days of the invasion. The war in the East was a brutal clash of ideologies, with both sides exhibiting unprecedented ferocity. In the end, the Soviet Union's ability to mobilize vast numbers of troops, maintain efficient logistics, and leverage its industrial capacity were crucial in overcoming the German threat. Stalin's understanding of these factors, particularly the importance of manpower, was instrumental in shaping the Soviet war effort. Numbers. The Soviet Union's victory in World War II was significantly aided by its vast numerical superiority in manpower and military equipment. A prime example was the production of the T-34 tank, a symbol of Soviet military prowess. Between 1941 and 1945, about 35,000 T-34 tanks were produced, along with nearly 30,000 of its upgraded version, the T-34-85. This output starkly contrasts with Germany's total tank production during the same period, highlighting the overwhelming Soviet advantage in terms of military hardware. The sheer scale of the Soviet war effort extended beyond tanks to include aircraft, transport vehicles, and other military supplies. This disparity was further amplified by the contribution of Allied forces, particularly the United States, which provided significant resources under the Lend-Lease program. Another testament to Soviet resilience during the war was the dismantling, transporting, and rebuilding of hundreds of factories to the east, away from the advancing German forces. This undertaking required thousands of rail cars per factory and greatly strained the Soviet transportation network. Yet it was crucial in preserving the industrial capacity necessary for the war effort. Stalin's regime, despite its many atrocities, played a pivotal role in holding the Soviet Union together during the war. His authoritarian control and determination were instrumental in mobilizing the country's resources and people for a prolonged and brutal conflict. The paradox of Stalin's leadership is that while he was responsible for the deaths of millions of his own citizens, his regime's resolve was vital in defeating Nazi Germany. The war transformed the Soviet Union into a world power, rivaling the United States, which emerged as the only superpower primarily due to its nuclear capability. The Soviet Union's subsequent development of nuclear weapons, leading to its first atomic bomb test in 1949 and its first hydrogen bomb test in 1955, marked the beginning of the Cold War arms race. Stalin's health deteriorated in his later years, compounded by the immense stress of his rule, heavy smoking, and drinking. He suffered a severe stroke in March 1953. He passed away on March 5th, leaving behind a complex legacy marked by both his ruthless dictatorship and his role in defeating one of the greatest threats to global peace. Summary: Joseph Stalin's journey from a 19th-century peasant to one of the most powerful men in the late 1940s is a story marked by dramatic transformation and brutal tactics. Initially, he operated like a crime boss, engaging in theft and violence. However, by the end of his rule, he was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions through executions, forced labor, and warfare during a period often regarded as the most extensive communist experiment of the 20th century. Critics argue that Stalin abandoned the ideals of Marxism, centralizing control under himself and creating a dictatorship that empowered him while denying workers a say in governance. This centralization starkly contrasts the communal ownership ethos of true communism. The debate over Stalin's legacy is complex. Many historians consider him the most successful dictator, having transformed the Soviet Union from a relatively weak state into a superpower, rivaling the United States. Yet this transformation came at a tremendous human cost. Some argue that the industrialization of Russia and China, under leaders like Stalin and Mao Zedong, could only have been achieved through authoritarian means. Others counter that such industrialization could have occurred through free markets and property rights, as seen in the West. Stalin's rise to power is often seen as a manifestation of George Orwell's observation that those overturning hierarchical structures often seek power themselves. His regime became more authoritarian and terrifying than the Tsarist regime he grew up despising. Estimates of the number of deaths Stalin was responsible for vary widely. Still, there's little dispute that he ranks among history's greatest mass murderers, alongside figures like Adolf Hitler and Mao Zedong. Despite this, Stalin is still revered by some in Russia for defeating Nazi Germany and transforming the Soviet Union into a superpower. In conclusion, Joseph Stalin's legacy is one of intelligence, hard work, ruthlessness, and pragmatism, marked by a dictatorship that resulted in millions of deaths, yet significantly shaped global history. What are your thoughts on Joseph Stalin's complex and controversial legacy? Share your views in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and remember to subscribe for more biography content.